There must be some mistake.
Mistake? We don't make mistakes. Bloody typical.
This is probably going to be a boring video because it's going to involve a lot of reading, but it's also going to be a very informative and enlightening video. So please try to watch the whole thing. If you can't watch the whole thing, set the setting for like a quicker speed. You can set it for like 1.5, or maybe watch half of the video now, half the video later, because this video is going to be very important. The two articles I will be covering in this video, both were published in the NCBI, which is the National Center for Biotechnology and Information, which are scholarly sources, so this information is 100% legitimate and vetted. So this is not fake information or misinformation or anything like that. So the article was published on July 1st, 2011. It is titled "The Elusive Definition of Pandemic Influenza," and its author is Peter Doshi. And because this article is so important, I'm going to be reading it in its entirety, starting from the abstract. So let's get started. There has been considerable controversy over the past year, particularly in Europe, over whether the World Health Organization, WHO, changed its definition of pandemic influenza in 2009 after novel H1N1 influenza was identified. Some have argued that not only was the definition changed, but that it was done to pave the way for declaring a pandemic. Others claim that the definition was never changed and that this allegation is completely unfounded. Such polarized views have hampered our ability to draw important conclusions. This impasse, combined with concerns over potential conflicts of interest and doubts about the proportionality of the response to the H1N1 influenza outbreak, has undermined the public trust in health officials and our collective capacity to effectively respond to future disease threats. WHO did not change its definition of pandemic influenza for the simple reason that it has never formally defined pandemic influenza. While WHO has put forth many descriptions of pandemic influenza, it has never established a formal definition. And the criteria for declaring a pandemic caused by the H1N1 virus derived from pandemic phase definitions, not from a definition of pandemic influenza. The fact that despite 10 years of pandemic preparedness activities, no formal definition of pandemic influenza has been formulated reveals important underlying assumptions about the nature of this infectious disease. In particular, the limitations of virus-centric approaches merit further attention and should inform ongoing efforts to learn lessons that will guide the response to future outbreaks of novel infectious diseases. So let's get right into the introduction. In 2009, governments throughout the world mounted large and costly responses to the H1N1 influenza outbreak. These efforts were largely justified on the premise that H1N1 influenza and seasonal influenza require different management, a premise reinforced by the decision on the part of the World Health Organization to label the H1N1 influenza outbreak a pandemic. However, the outbreak had far less serious consequences than experts had predicted, a fact that led many to wonder if the public health responses to H1N1 had not been disproportionately aggressive. In addition, concerns over ties between WHO advisors and industry fueled suspicion about the independence and appropriateness of the decisions made at the national and international levels. Central to this debate has been the question of whether H1N1 influenza should have been labeled a pandemic at all. The Council of Europe voiced serious concerns that the declaration of pandemic became possible only after WHO changed its definition of pandemic influenza. It also expressed misgivings over WHO's decision to withhold publication of the names of its H1N1 Advisory Emergency Committee. WHO, however, denied having changed any definition and defended the scientific validity of its decisions, citing numerous safeguards for handling potential conflicts of interest. At stake in this debate are the public trust in health officials and our collective capacity to respond effectively to future disease threats. Understanding this controversy entails acknowledging that both parties are partially correct, and to resolve it, we must re-evaluate how emerging threats should be defined in a world where the simple act of labeling a disease has enormous social, economic, and political implications. So that ends the introduction. Before I move on to the next section of this article, I just want to say that you're going to see that both parties are not partially correct. One party is correct, and then the other party, the WHO, is being an Orwellian snake-tongue weasel. What sparked the controversy? Since 2003, the top of the WHO Pandemic Preparedness homepage has contained the following statement. An influenza pandemic occurs when a new influenza virus appears against which the human population has no immunity, resulting in several simultaneous epidemics worldwide with enormous numbers of deaths and illness. However, on May 4th, 2009, scarcely 1 month before the H1N1 pandemic was declared, the web page was altered in response to a query from a CNN reporter. The phrase, enormous numbers of death and illness, has been removed, and the revised web page simply reads as follows, quote, an influenza pandemic may occur when a new influenza virus appears against which the human population has no immunity. Now, before I move on, I want to also make it clear that not only was the part about deaths and illness removed, but they also added that may occur part. See, before it says an influenza pandemic occurs when this happens. Now the new one has actually been changed to an influenza pandemic may occur, meaning that they're just assuming, may occur when a new influenza virus appears against which the human population has no immunity. Anyway, I digress, now let me continue. Months later, the Council of Europe would cite this alteration as evidence that WHO changed its definition of pandemic influenza to enable it to declare a pandemic without having to demonstrate the intensity of the disease caused by the H1N1 virus. Doesn't that sound very similar to how the CDC just changed its definition for vaccine? And not only did the CDC change the definition for vaccine, but a lot of people don't realize that the Merriam-Webster dictionary also changed its definition for vaccine. Anyway, let's now move on to the next part of the article, which contains the most Orwellian doublespeak I have ever heard in my life. A description versus a definition. Harvey Finberg, chairman of a WHO-appointed International Health Regulations Review Committee that evaluated WHO's response to H1N1 influenza, identified the definition of pandemic influenza as a critical element of our review. In a draft report released in March, the committee faulted WHO for inadequately dispelling confusion about the definition of a pandemic and noted WHO's reluctance to acknowledge its part in allowing misunderstanding of the web page alteration, which WHO has characterized as a change in the description but not in the definition of pandemic influenza. It's not a definition, but we recognize that it could be taken as such. It was the fault of ours, confusing descriptions and definitions, a WHO communications officer declared. Indeed, the Council of Europe was not alone in claiming that the definition had been changed. WHO argues that this phrase, which could be more neutrally referred to as a description definition, had little bearing on policy responses. A WHO press release states that it was, quote, never part of the formal definition of a pandemic and was never sent to member states, but simply appeared in a document on the WHO's website for some months. In actuality, the description definition was displayed at the top of the WHO Pandemic Preparedness homepage for over 6 years and is consistent with the descriptions of pandemic influenza put forth in various WHO policy documents over the years. However, while the original description definition unambiguously describes disease severity and certainly reflects general assumptions about pandemic influenza before novel H1N1 emerged, it is unrelated to the criteria WHO applied to declare H1N1 influenza a pandemic. Okay, before I move on to the next part, I want to make something very clear. Because after that whole spiel, after all of that information, the author of this article still tries to claim that this description definition had nothing to do, or as it says here, is unrelated to the criteria who applied to declare the H1N1 influenza a pandemic. However, this is not true. As you're going to see, the article is going to go on and complain about how the WHO stopped accounting for the severity of the disease. This is what it's going to go on to explain. It's going to talk about how the WHO used the definition of pandemic phases to declare a pandemic, and how those pandemic phases do not really pertain to the severity of the pandemic. However, the original definition did have to do with the severity of the disease. Once they removed the pandemic relating to severity of the disease, it then allowed them to only use the definitions of these pandemic phases, which, as you're going to see, has very little to nothing to do with the severity of the disease. So with that said, let's move on to the next part of the article, which is titled Definitions of Pandemic Phases, Not Pandemic Influenza. So what they're going to say now is that they use the definition of pandemic phases to declare this pandemic and not the definition of pandemic influenza. So let's get right into it. In a press conference, WHO explained that, quote, the formal definitions of pandemics by WHO can be seen in the guidelines, unquote. This was a reference to WHO's Pandemic Influenza Preparedness Guidelines, first developed in 1999 and revised in 2005 and 2009. However, none of these documents contains what might reasonably be considered a formal definition of pandemic influenza, Table 1. A fact that may explain why WHO refrained from offering a quotable definition despite its repeated assurances that the definition was never changed. The startling and inevitable conclusion is that despite 10 years of issuing guidelines for pandemic preparedness, WHO has never formulated a formal definition of pandemic influenza. So the WHO claims that it never changed the definition of pandemic, but that's because it never had a definition of pandemic. Now what's interesting though is if you look at this table that's presented in the article, which I have brought up in a different window so that it can all be seen in one context, I don't have to scroll through it, it says something very interesting here. So in 1999, the basis for declaring a pandemic was, quote, the pandemic will be declared when the new virus subtype has been shown to cause several outbreaks in at least one country and to have spread to other countries with consistent disease patterns indicating that serious morbidity and mortality is likely in at least one segment of the population. So in 1999, their basis for declaring a pandemic, they didn't have a definition for pandemic, but their basis for pandemic did include something about mortality. So it did include the severity of the disease. However, if you look in 2009 and even in 2005, they completely did away with that severity aspect. In 2005, a pandemic will be said to have begun when a new influenza virus subtype is declared to have reached phase 6. Phase 6 is defined as increased and sustained transmission in the general population. So in 2005, they completely get rid of severity, they completely get rid of mortality, and they're just like, yeah, as long as we find that there's a new subtype virus spreading amongst the population, it doesn't matter if it's severe or not, it only matters that there are cases, they deem that that could be considered a pandemic. Now let's return back to the article. What WHO's pandemic preparedness guidelines do contain are pandemic phase definitions. WHO declared a pandemic on June 11, 2009, after determining that the novel H1N1 virus was causing community-level outbreaks in at least 2 WHO regions, in keeping with the definition of pandemic phase 6. The declaration of phase 6 reflected wider global dissemination of H1N1, not disease severity. But unlike other numerical scales, such as the Cipher-Simpson Hurricane Wind Scale based on 5 categories, WHO's 6-point pandemic phase determinations do not correlate with clinical severity, but rather with the likelihood of disease occurrence. This point has received widespread attention and criticism. Now we move on to the next part of the article, which is titled Bridging the Gap. Had the novel 2009 H1N1 virus caused exceptional severe disease, the extensive preparations and planning in recent years would have surely put us in a better position to respond to such a crisis, and decision-making at WHO would not have come under intense scrutiny. But in the case of H1N1, governments mounted extraordinary and costly responses to what turned out to be mostly ordinary disease. This resulted in much scrutiny and controversy over the decision-making process. As future policy responses to emerging infectious diseases will not succeed without the trust and understanding of the public, officials must revise the way they think about and characterize emerging diseases. A first step is to openly acknowledge past failures in risk assessment. The description definition of pandemic influenza that was on WHO's website for so long, unchallenged and unchanged for years, is perhaps the most striking illustration that expert institutions assumed pandemics to be, in their basic nature, catastrophic events. What really bothers me about this part here, this is me digressing, is that the author here has not made clear which description definition he is talking about. It appears like he's talking about the updated description definition, which doesn't include severity, and which just automatically assumes that any pandemic will in itself be a catastrophic event. That's what it appears like with what he says after that sentence. But I digress. Let me go back to reading the article. According to the IHR Review Committee, the description definition was, quote, understandable in the context of expectations about influenza H5N1. But its appearance dates back to at least early 2003, when only 18 human cases of H5N1 were known. Now here, it does appear like he's talking about the updated description definition. Here, it seems like he's saying the IHR Review Committee was saying the description definition was understandable because it applied to the context of what they knew about the avian influenza, and I think the author is responding, but its appearance, and when it says its appearance, I think he's referring to the H1N1 influenza. So he's saying that like the appearance of H5N1 influenza goes back or dates back to early 2003 when only 18 human cases of H5N1 were known. So basically he's saying like, oh, the IHR review committee saying that this description definition, which lacks severity, is understandable because it was in the context of avian influenza. This guy's saying that doesn't make any sense because avian influenza goes back as far as 2003. So if anything, they should have changed the description definition, which doesn't talk about severity, back then in 2003. But I digress. I'm just trying to make this more clear because these guys can't write for shit. But it is by no means the only example of false assumptions. A 2005 WHO preparedness document titled 10 Things You Need to Know About Pandemic Influenza stated that, quote, large numbers of deaths will occur, and economic and social disruption will be great. Statistical projections of future pandemic mortality varied widely, but even the self-described best-case scenarios yielded numbers that were 4 to 30 times greater than the estimated numbers of deaths from seasonal influenza. Also, over the last 5 years, public health experts and policymakers have helped consolidate the idea that a pandemic is of necessity a catastrophe through repeated mentions of the severe 1918 pandemic in order to rouse governments and the public. And this makes sense. They're always referring to the pandemic of 1918 and the severity of it, but, with these other pandemics, they completely ignored the severity of it, and they just assume that it's going to be severe. They just assume that it's going to be like the 1918 pandemic, which I would like to say has a lot of controversy surrounding it. Let's just say the 1918 pandemic isn't as cut and dry as the experts would have you believe. Maybe in the future I'll do a video specifically about the 1918 pandemic, but I'm not making any promises. But I digress. Descriptions of H5N1 as a pandemic candidate virus because it had met all the requirements only reinforced the message that a serious outbreak was inevitable. The focus on 1918 and H5N1 came at the cost of preparing for possible future outbreaks similar to the 1957 and 1968 pandemics. These outbreaks, talking about the 1957-1968 pandemics, in contrast to the one in 1918, were similar to seasonal influenza and sometimes milder. Indeed, historical descriptions of events in 1957 and 1968 have been mixed, a fact that highlights the lack of standardized measures of severity, Table 2. Preparations for future outbreaks must take stock of all of the evidence, not just the most alarming. Then the article presents Table 2, which is titled Descriptions of Influenza Outbreaks That Have Carried the Pandemic Label. And this table shows that the same pandemics had several different descriptions. And this is once again to show that there is a lack of a standardized method. A very interesting one I find is the 1968 pandemic, nicknamed the Hong Kong flu. This description down here, where it says, quote, few people who lived through it even knew it occurred. John Barry. But anyway, let's move on to the next part of the Bridging the Gap. Second, it is time to re-examine assumptions driven by virus-centric thinking. The fact that the spread of overwhelmingly mild disease by a novel virus such as H1N1 could meet current Phase 6 criteria highlights the shortcomings of virological assumptions and their central role in defining pandemic response measures. The enduring belief is that highly transmissible novel influenza viruses can be expected to cause serious disease and even death because the population lacks immunity against them. However, this view is challenged by the recent experience with H1N1 and other influenza pandemics. During the 2009 H1N1 outbreak, relatively few elderly people got sick, despite the widespread circulation of the so-called novel virus, and when they did, the symptoms were mild in most cases. So, this is attacking this assumption that all novel viruses are super deadly. Virus-centric thinking is also at the bottom of the current practice of dichotomizing influenza into pandemic and interpandemic or seasonal influenza on the basis of genetic mutations in the virus. This approach, however, ignores the fact that the severity and impact of epidemics, whether caused by influenza viruses or other pathogens, occur along a spectrum and not in catastrophic versus non-catastrophic proportions. We need responses that are calibrated to the nature of the threat rather than driven by these rigid categories. It should say these rigid categories and assumptions. The IHR Review Committee has called for simplifying the pandemic phase structure and for plans that emphasize a risk-based approach to enable a more flexible response to different scenarios. However, implementing this will remain difficult as long as health officials feel compelled to err on the side of safety and respond to any novel influenza virus as if it were potentially a worst-case scenario. We therefore need evidence-based ways to address hypothetical scenarios of non-zero probability, such as the fear, based on a very partial reading of history, that novel influenza pathogens acquire increased virulence during successive waves of infection. Basically, he's saying that we need to base our policies off of actual evidence and not off of the fear-based thinking of these people who really don't know much about history. Let's move on to the next part of this same bridging the gap point. Virus-centric thinking may heavily influence pandemic influenza planning because of the considerable weight of expert opinion. Bonnehue and Van Dam have argued that disease experts are not necessarily competent to judge a disease's relative importance against competing health priorities, and final evidence-based policy advice should be drafted by independent scientists trained in evaluation and priority setting. This advice is consistent with the views of this guy and Finberg, who noted over 3 decades ago in their review of the 1976 swine flu affair in the United States of America that panels tend toward groupthink and overselling, tendencies nurtured by long-standing interchanges and intimacy, as in the influenza fraternity. Other competent scientists who do not share their group identity or vested interest should be able to appraise the scientific logic applied to available evidence. However, the IHR Review Committee's draft report issued in March 2011 is less demanding. Of course it's not, because they were bought and sold. It calls for an appropriate spectrum of expertise to advise WHO's Director General, but fails to specify whether this should include non-influenza experts such as general epidemiologists, general practitioners, and health economists. Third, we must come to broader agreement about acceptable sources of expert advice. While the IHR Review Committee, quote, found no evidence of malfeasance, unquote, it urged WHO to clarify its standards and adopt transparent procedures for the appointment of members of expert committees. Since the 1980s, partnerships between industry and academia have grown increasingly close. Today, for example, both government officials and academic influenza scientists belong to the neuraminidase inhibitor susceptibility network, a group founded by GlaxoSmithKline and Roche. Much work is needed to ensure that decisions are not unwittingly influenced by industrial interest. Finally, we must remember the purpose of pandemic preparedness, which was fundamentally predicated on the assumption that pandemic influenza requires a different policy response than does annual seasonal influenza. The pandemic label must of necessity carry a notion of severity, for otherwise the rationale behind the original policy of having pandemic plans, distinct from ongoing public health programs, would be called into question. Insofar as these plans allow us to effectively respond to the spread of severe infectious diseases, regardless of the pathogens that cause them, planning for hypothetical worst-case scenarios has value. But such scenarios are rare, and when they do occur, few people will require convincing that urgent action is needed. Indeed, if we do face the threat of widespread disease causing severe symptoms, the definition of pandemic influenza will likely become moot. And that's the end of the article, and I just want to say that we clearly did not learn our lesson from the 2009 Scamdemic and the information and arguments made in that article. Now, with that said, I do want to say there is another article which attempts to critique that article, and this article was actually published on the exact same day, and it is titled "The Classical Definition of a Pandemic is Not Elusive." And the person in this article, the author of this article, Heath Kelly, basically argues that the WHO's declaration of a pandemic was in fact in line with the classical definition of a pandemic. To me, this article is very dishonest because it acknowledges other issues with the WHO, but it really fixates on the classical definition of a pandemic, and it totally ignores all of the points that the other article made. It's basically like, oh, well, look, the classical definition is also jacked up and mentions nothing about severity, so it's perfectly fine what the WHO did. It's a bullshit form of reasoning that is technically correct, but totally ignores and doesn't even try to argue the points and the arguments made in the previous article about the need to also include severity in our pandemic definitions. And I'd like to also finish off by just simply saying that I don't agree with any sort of pandemic preparedness plans. I don't believe that any governments or any institutions should have the authority to lock people down or to do any extreme measures regardless of any extreme scenarios. I don't care if there's a fucking zombie apocalypse going on and 80% of the people are turning into zombies. The governments should not have the right to restrict, violate, remove, suspend, or do anything to our inalienable rights. They are inalienable. I prefer dangerous freedom over peaceful slavery, and I agree with the statement that any society that gives up its freedoms for a little security deserves neither security or freedoms.
I'll be back.